Okay. So before we kind of dive into the meat of the conversation, I do want to quickly go down the line again to familiarize everybody in the room with what the wonderful people here on stage are currently working on. Gafar and Hadiyah, maybe I'll start with you guys. Can you tell me a little bit about what you are currently working on?
So 5 years ago, we founded Groundswell Project, and it's basically an organization set up to empower vulnerable individuals, women, refugees, anyone who is easily exploited in society, exploited by criminals, exploited by terrorists, exploited by governments. And, you know, we set up a whole project and program to basically empower people across the world, across different communities.
Awesome.
What she said. I would just add, in our view, financial autonomy is a basic human right. And it's a human right that's not being spoken about enough by human rights organizations. And this is something we want to bring to the forefront of the debate around human rights.
Perfect. Richard, I'll go to you next. Can you give yourself a little intro?
Yeah, so I'm currently working at a foundation where we sort of defend democracy, and the way I do that is through organizing these democracy tech hackathons to help tech entrepreneurs basically develop solutions to democracy's problems, mostly in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and Armenia. Currently, I don't do any work with Bitcoin, but really I attended the Human Rights Foundation's Oslo Freedom Forum last year, and everything changed. And that is going to be sort of the case for our conversation today.
Awesome. And Femi, I'll go to you last.
Yeah, my name is Femi. I am the Global Bitcoin Lead at the Human Rights Foundation. I run our Bitcoin Development Fund, which supports projects that help us make Bitcoin continue to be great freedom money for human rights activists operating in authoritarian regimes, but also helps us get Bitcoin to them in tools that makes it easy for them to use.
So I find that a lot of these discussions, they have more impact when you can see the human side of things, when people can relate to or identify with the impact that it's having. So this is kind of for everyone, so I'll probably go down the line again, but I'd love each of you to share a small story from either your work or just your general experiences where Bitcoin has directly empowered someone in a challenging environment, and also what's one big lesson that you've learned from that experience. And maybe Femi, I'll start down with you with your work with the HRF, all of that. What have you seen and what has impacted you and impacted others around you?
Yeah, so like I said, I'm from Nigeria, and interestingly, Kale mentioned the protests in Nigeria in 2020. So in 2020, Nigeria had its biggest protest in a long time. And interestingly, the protest was against a unit of the police that was targeting mostly young men and extorting them. So the police would arrest a young man if he has an earring or he has dreads like Richard. They assume, or they see a laptop with him, they assume he must be a fraudster. They start checking his emails. They take him to an ATM and empty his bank account. So Nigerians got frustrated, and across the world, Nigerians mobilized to tell the government to close that unit. The protest was more organized than most protests in Nigeria because we had decentralized organization of legal aid, decentralized organization of food for people who were protesting. And then when the government tried multiple means, they went after freezing the bank account of the people who they thought were the leaders of the protest. Because again, it was a protest where people said explicitly, we have no leaders, we're decentralized. And Bitcoin came to the rescue. People across the diaspora sent funding to the protests with Bitcoin. When they froze bank accounts, the operations could still continue using Bitcoin. And that for me was the first time, at least from a practical standpoint, I saw Bitcoin being used effectively in human rights. Within the foundation, one of our colleagues who used to be the CFO of the Anti-Corruption Foundation, Alexei Navalny's foundation in Russia. Interestingly, I think in our own case, they went into their bank account one day and they didn't just freeze their bank accounts. The Russian government put them in debt to the tune of minus $13 billion in their bank account. So imagine being the CFO going to your bank account to pay salaries, and you don't just see zero balance, you see minus 13 billion balance. And the only way the organization could continue their work was using Bitcoin as a lifeline. So I've seen instances where people who want to stand up against authoritarianism find that when they go after the money, which is the easiest way to squeeze out air from a protest or a movement, that the best way to continue to operate is money that they can't see. They can't see who you're sending it to. They can't see who you're sending it from. Because in many countries, if they see on your bank account that you got funding from the HRF, which is an American organization, the first thing the government does is they brand you as an American spy. And that becomes their reason to actually taint your protest. So this is something that we see constantly in the work.
Awesome. Ghaffar, I'm going to go to you next, and given that you and Hadiyah are working together, I'll let you kind of play off each other and see if you want to tag in together.
We could probably give different examples. I'm going to go back to the one I mentioned in my talk earlier about remittances. So this is a conversation I had with a close friend who told me that, Sri Lanka is very remittance dependent. People, the local economy is not very strong, so people send their sons abroad to work, to send money back, and some families are very dependent on those remittances just to survive and be able to afford basic goods and necessities. But if the local people know a particular mother is regularly going to the Western Union to collect money, she becomes an obvious target for all sorts of violence and extortion. And that makes her life very difficult. Imagine the psychological impact of knowing that people know I collect money every Thursday at that place. And that has a psychological effect on her. That's very detrimental. But then being able to receive that money as a lightning payment and then suddenly... that's the privacy you talked about, Femi. Being able to have financial, privacy and not be a target of violence or kidnap and threats. It was life-changing for her, really, and for the community, because some of these gangsters have no one to chase, if it takes off in a big way. So I think that's a really interesting use case of where Bitcoin solved a real problem.
Hadiyah, I'll let you tag in as well.
Well, you gave a different example. I hold generational trauma. I think that's a big buzzword now. My mother was a refugee. She was almost kidnapped by the dictator Idi Amin. And these are stories that I grew up with. My father, coming from the global south, came from extreme poverty. A lot of them say that they always talk about how they don't have shoes. And you're sitting there and you're just feeling very guilty that you've got shoes. And, I don't know what they're trying to achieve, but I'm sure they wanted to pass down, like, you are so very lucky to have all of these things. And I went this step further and thought, okay, yes, I'm lucky. What do I do about this situation I am in? I'm very lucky. So I dedicated a lot of my work to working with refugees and asylum seekers and looking at ways to empower them. When I came across Bitcoin, it was very much aligned with the understanding of injustice and redressing imbalance. And I've been working with women and these communities for decades, and I wanted to know, how could I relay this message to them? When I was at the Human Rights Foundation, I was thinking, this is too good to be just kept in this space. I need to spread this. And it was quite daunting because I was like, I know I have to do this. I can't do it alone, but it has to be done. And so I invited Ghaffar to join the organization. I was like, come and help me. And we set up trying to educate women around Bitcoin, refugees around Bitcoin, and how they can potentially escape all of the blocks from no bank accounts to, getting loans for businesses and empowering themselves. So the kind of aha moment for me was when, I got the understanding that this needs to be a message that has to be spread, and looking at the people who would need it most, in the UK, I just want to give an example of what the situation is. There are asylum seekers and refugees in hotels. They've been in no man's land since 2020. They can't work, they can't have bank accounts, and they're just being left. So we've been going into these hotels and trying to educate them on how they can potentially come out of that, sticky situation. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the kind of passionate thing that affected me when I understood what Bitcoin does. The philosophy of Satoshi is very much aligned with what we're doing, and how can we push that messaging, to the people who need it? And I'm here with fellow people trying to do that.
Awesome. Richard, I'm going to jump to you next. Is there an experience or a particular thing that you've come across where somebody was empowered by Bitcoin that really spoke to you or stood out in your mind?
I think I'm going to share a personal story. And to those of you that don't know, the dictator that Hadiyah was talking about, Idi Amin, was a Ugandan dictator. It doesn't mean that things are better now in Uganda, where I was born and raised. I've spent the past 10 to 15 years basically dedicating my life to fighting the dictatorship of Museveni. I started doing that through hip-hop music because it gave me a voice to really speak up against the powers that be. And then when I moved to Europe, I sort of continued with that mission, but differently. I just spoke about the hackathons that I organize in Eastern Europe. But what happens after you've been doing the same thing for 5 years, something that you really so passionately care about, but from here on, you see that things are getting worse and worse and worse. And this has been the case. You know you're doing the right thing, but really, because the system and the way it's designed, it promises you a certain kind of freedom that is always distant. And it can be very depressing and demotivating. And there was something that happened when I discovered Bitcoin, something that I was also talking to you about yesterday. It felt like it was the last piece of the freedom puzzle. When it hits you, you know this is the right thing. It's just so difficult to actually to convince the people, because the systems that we're really operating in don't allow us to put this knowledge to the people that deserve to hear it. And that's why we actually, I'm stepping out on stage for the first time to speak about Bitcoin, because I'm very convinced that this is the solution that the world needs to achieve that freedom that we're all fighting for. And the spaces like Oslo Freedom Forum, it is a special place, because people like me, we really care about democracy, we care about freedom, but we don't know that there is something else that can allow us to have that freedom. We don't really come to Bitcoin conferences because it's usually very distant. So these spaces that allow us really to, come with the mission that we care about, but still learn about Bitcoin and how it can change the world. This is really the story.
Something that struck me about when we were talking outside yesterday, you effectively said, I've been doing all of this work for quite some time, and I felt like I had an intimate understanding of the word and the meaning of freedom. But then I encountered Bitcoin, and I felt like I completely shifted my entire perspective on what that even means. And that was pretty powerful. And on top of that, this is very new for you. You said you've just fallen down that rabbit hole a year ago.
It's been a year. I mean, I've spent a lot of time on your YouTube videos, Ben, so thank you so much for that. But really, what Bitcoin does to you, I mean, I don't look at the number go up. I'm a freedom go up person, but it allows you to see the duality of the world that we live in very much clearer. On the one hand, we have, the Bitcoin world where there is a lot of hope, there is a lot of love. You see a bright future out there. And really in the fiat world, no matter how you're fighting for freedom and democracy, there is something wrong. You can feel it, the corruption, the lies, but also the truth that's not told about money. And when you read about money, you almost get sick. I've spent the last 6 months thinking, how can I actually get out of a system that I don't believe in anymore to dedicate my time and energy to something that I care about? And that's what Bitcoin does to you. It refreshes you so that you can start spending time on the things that you care about, the podcast, or even spending time with your family. I see Bitcoiners here coming with their families, and I think this is a true instance of Bitcoin, to remind you Where can you best invest your time and energy for the greater good of the universe? And that's beautiful.
I love that. And the interesting thing, and I'm gonna tee this up for Femi, because you were telling me that going to human rights events and being present, and then you kept on, and I think it was Gladstein that kept on saying, get over to the Bitcoin room. Come on, no, leave me alone. I'm not going in there. And then you ended up seated at a table at a dinner with a bunch of Bitcoiners, and you're like, these people are on an entirely different planet. I don't know what's going on, but it spurred your curiosity. And this is something that I've encountered going to the Oslo Freedom Forum. The difference between 2022 to the subsequent years, I feel that it's a huge shift from skepticism and rooms that basically the Bitcoiners would just kind of aggregate together, and there'd be very few actual activists in the room. And the questions that they would ask, I felt initially came from a place of, I'm going to ask this question as like an intentional gotcha so that I can prove that this couldn't work, to this past Oslo Freedom Forum being in the room, and the number of activists has far overtaken the Bitcoiners in the room, and most people are there from genuine curiosity and the multiple touch points they've realized this actually can be an effective tool in their tool belt. So Femi, I want to tease some of that, and maybe you can tag in here and add some of your perspective about how effective it's been, and the shift in mentality of the general kind of Human Rights Foundation and the people attending those events, how that has changed and what you've seen on your end.
I mean, it's interesting because two years ago at the Oslo Freedom Forum, I met Hadiyah and Gafar. Last year, I met Richard. I think what's interesting, and I was having a conversation with someone yesterday about Bitcoin education, is I think the better way to educate people about Bitcoin is not to make it about Bitcoin. It's to make it about the person and the problem they're experiencing. My frustration, and we fund Bitcoin education work, and I said earlier, is a lot of what we call Bitcoin education is people coming to talk at people about this technology. Yes, you find it wonderful. It's the best thing since sliced bread. But the other person doesn't really give a shit. What they care about, what every human being innately cares about, is themselves and the problems they're experiencing. So what the better way to go about it is, rather than talk about Bitcoin, actually be curious about the person. Ask questions about who they are. Find out what they're experiencing, what problems they're facing, and then help them figure out how Bitcoin can be a solution to a specific problem they're facing that touches money. And if that's all they know about Bitcoin in that moment, let it just be that. And I think in the context of human rights activists, and Ben, you're a part of the journey of the webinars we do every quarter, we don't make it about Bitcoin. We make it about the financial repression experiences that people who are trying to fight against dictators experience. And you talk about their problems, people who have been debunked, people who have had to flee for their lives and couldn't live with any of their wealth, people who had their donors, people who donated to them, being arrested for donating to them, or in the case of a journalist in Angola who had the government speak to all the businesses in the country and said, if you advertise in his newspaper, we go after you, so that they squeeze him. And so the conversation is not about him trying to understand Bitcoin, this wonderful technology. The conversation for him is, how do I find a tool that helps me transcend this problem that I have? I think we've had more of that in our conversation, our engagement with the activists. You gave the example of Berta, who started as an activist trying to get her husband out of jail, to someone who is now an active Bitcoin educator. In the grants we give, we also give grants to activists too, who are using and who are increasingly using Bitcoin in the course of their work. So the engagement changes, when it's not, oh, that's the Bitcoin crowd and we are the activist crowd. It's, we have a problem in the course of the work that we're doing that's very important to us, that we're very passionate about. The people that come to Oslo are some of the bravest people in the world, because for a single 5'2" woman to stand up against Putin and the might of the Russian government, you have to be immensely brave. And for them to see Bitcoin not as that speculative thing that everybody screams about, to a vital tool that we use to do our work, it changes the game, and it changes their interaction, and it changes the way they see the technology, and it makes it easier for them to engage with the people who are working on the technology. So it's no longer, those are the Bitcoin crowd, these are us. It's, you guys are helping build tools that empower us to do our work. And that makes the engagement much richer.
I think just building on that, and agree with what you say, Femi, but I think the problem is so difficult because people have problems that they don't even know is a problem, and they don't even, it's so embedded. Now, one of the things we don't have, certainly in the UK, we don't have financial education. When you go to school, you learn all sorts of things that you're never going to use in the rest of your life, like, you know, algebra or something. But, you know, we don't talk about money. What is money? You know, how do you spend money? How do you save money? All just the basics, investing. It's just not taught. It's just not talked about. So, for example, in India, something I was reading about the other day, women get a lower credit rating just for being women, for no other reason. If you're a female, naturally your credit rating is lower in India. Now, people who grow up in that culture just think that's just the way it is. I've got to work with this system. So Bitcoin represents a reset. Because actually we can get away with, you know, hundreds of years of cultural conditioning where you get to a situation where a woman would naturally have a poorer credit rating because she's female, and say, actually, no, we can create a level playing field. But people don't even know that's a problem. So when you come along and say, here's a solution, they're like, well, I didn't even know this was a problem. So you've got to identify the problem first, you know?
Yeah. And I agree with that. However, to be clear, not everybody in this world is excited to have those deep conversations about financial architecture. You will get them on the journey to those conversations. But the starting point is you need to get them in the door. And the easiest way to get them in the door is find something that's crucial about them. So if you have a conversation with the woman, what are you doing? How's your life? Where's your husband? How are your kids? And you guys do it in the course of your work. The conversations you have about Bitcoin to those women is taking into consideration their culture, their tradition, the things they are going with. And the questions they ask you is also tied to that. So it's not Bitcoin for Bitcoin's sake. It is you, the human being, that is important. And this is the tool that helps you achieve what you want. And so the starting point is critical, but if we don't get the starting point right, the tendency that we turn people off completely, and then they lose the opportunity to get the deeper message. And then as long as what we start with them is a journey that then helps them get deeper as they go on, the better. A lot of conversations in the space about custody or self-custody. When someone is coming into Bitcoin the first time, give them the easiest thing that they need to actually use the technology, and then take them on that journey.
Can I just come in again with that? It's not an easy feat to go into a new community or a marginalized community to talk about Bitcoin. But I just want to show you, you know, the journey where I was like, Gafar and I were like, we are going to do this. And this is an image here, hopefully you can put it up, of us doing actual training. And I just, can we get that up? Just to give you a...
I think they were showing, yeah.
Yeah, so there's training going on there. And we cannot underestimate the intelligence and ambition of these women. Talking to somebody about Bitcoin in the West has been very tough. My white friends, my English friends just think I'm really dodgy and just like, you know, stop talking about it. I was in the room in London with Gafar, and we could just see this black, you know, we didn't see anything, did we? And we don't know who's in the room, what's going on, do they even understand what we're saying? But we were so pleasantly surprised how they just got it. Women get money. And everybody was like, you know, agreed that they are better with money than their husbands. an example, I just want to show you what we were doing. It went better than I'd expected. I was so encouraged by this conversation. And I said, human rights have the Bitcoin Humanitarian Alliance. So when you bring people out of poverty, you make them less vulnerable, and we empower people through finances. With, if you just want to bring up the spices, in this conversation, there were some women we sell food at kiosk, but we can't get a loan. We don't have a bank. Our kids are hungry. Our family is suffering. Our kids are being recruited by Al-Shabaab, some, terrorists and all sorts of things. And we cannot, compete with these guys, but we want to earn our money. And, these are not stupid women. These are very intelligent women. And there's plans, hopefully, to help these women out of poverty through helping them through. One of the ladies has a business making spices. She can't get a loan from a bank. And we're looking into the possibility of giving her a loan through microfinance, through Bitcoin. That would improve her life hugely and her family's life. And just again, we haven't got much time, but I wanted to share my enthusiasm and encouragement that this is not just, it can't be done, it's too difficult, it's quite easy. I got encouraged, basically. This last testimonial made me realize how intelligent these women are. She's like, Bitcoin is a type of cryptocurrency. It's not controlled by the government bank. She is listening to me and Gafar from London in that space, getting all of it, everything. There's only 21 million Bitcoin. I'm interested to know more about Bitcoin and to buy and carry out transactions. And they're asked if they were a majority Muslim, and they're like, is it halal? They were switched on. So I'm going to be doing more of these types of education with the plan to give them understanding of how they can improve their lives. That is all we want to do, and we want your kind of support.
That's awesome.
Just, if I could, just quickly on that point about halal. So in the Muslim world, there is a conversation about halal and haram money, i.e. money that is allowed and money that's not allowed. Fiat money is actually haram. Islamically, it's forbidden. Just the Muslim countries have just found some clever legalistic ways around it, but essentially it's not allowed. Everything must be backed by something. Bitcoin, I've written an article about this for Bitcoin magazine. Bitcoin is the most halal form of money to ever exist. Ever exist. And this hasn't taken off as an idea, but it's so compliant with it's a Sharia principle of finance. It's unbelievable. It's almost like they were written for Bitcoin. It's so halal. It's amazing.
It's so halal. That's what we said.
All right, I'm going to do a quick lightning round down the panel. We're in the room with a lot of kind of veteran Bitcoiners, people that are also building a lot of the tools and services and things like that. I would love each of you to give a quick call to action for the Bitcoiners in the room that can help supercharge the work that you are doing. And Femi, I'm going to start with you. What would you beckon the Bitcoiners in the room to do?
So I give away money for a living, which is good, and I think is something people may want to hear. But I'm constantly looking for good ideas that can help us turn all the things we're talking about into practical reality. So if you're working on an interesting project that you think can add value to Bitcoin and to human rights activists across the world, reach out to me for a conversation or go to our website, hrf.org/devfund, apply for funding.
Perfect. Gafar, how about yourself?
A wise man once said, birds born in a cage think flying is an illness. I think for me that essentially talks about the use cases. We need to create more awareness of the use cases and just how many problems Bitcoin can actually fix.
Awesome. Richard?
I mean, I see Bitcoin as therapy for the hopeless, and I see Bitcoin as the future of philanthropy. Bitcoin needs faces like me because there are people out there in the world that can't relate to Michael Saylor. So really, we're here to push the same cause forward, users.
Awesome. Hadiyah?
the devs are the brains, we're kind of like the hearts, and we need this symbiotic relationship to make this work. We have to stick together, learn from each other, come and learn from our work, come and engage. I don't know what that will look like because, you know, let's face it, this whole thing is experimental, but with the correct intentions, with the right heart, with the right, mindset, I really believe we can, we can make this happen and make it work together.
Perfect timing. Thank you all so much. Please give her a big round of applause.